and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're going to be looking at a couple of accounts of Jesus getting into controversy with other religious leaders and thinking through the kind of difference between the big picture as they saw it and the big picture that Jesus was putting forward. Before we dive into that, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 23, through to chapter 3, verse 6. Now, as we learnt back in verse 1 of chapter 2, the action in today's reading takes place in Capernaum, in Jesus' adopted hometown, amid the opposition to him that we can see already growing after his healing of a man who was paralysed in chapter 2, verses 2 to 12. Jesus, it seems, had angered the scribes who were there that day by talking about setting this man free from his sins, something that only God was meant to be able to do. And it seems that incident had kind of almost like sort of painted a target on Jesus's back, if you will, and made him catch the eye of the religious authorities. They were further annoyed in verses 13 to 17 when they saw Jesus calling a tax collector, Levi, to be one of his disciples, and then eating with tax collectors and sinners, people who were outcasts, the kind of people you didn't hang around with if you were a respectable person. By eating with them, Jesus was treating those people as his equals. And finally, Jesus attracted some controversy because he and his disciples were not fasting at the same time the disciples of both the Pharisees and John the Baptist were, which leads to Jesus' teaching about wine being put into old wineskins in verses 18 to 22. So today's reading has two controversy episodes, if you will, in a section of 5 altogether. And the setting specifically is the Sabbath. Now, there were restrictions on what it was permitted to do on the Sabbath, what work was allowed and not allowed. And some of those are very specific and they go back to the law of Moses. But others have been developed as rabbis tried to interpret the law of Moses, and layers of oral law had built up. So there was a great deal of detail kicking around. Jesus' actions in this text serve to highlight his fundamental values, the fundamental vision that he had underlying what he was about. And it sets us up for much of the rest of what we find in Mark's Gospel. Now, one way or another, we have quite a range of different characters popping up in this passage. So firstly, we've got Jesus in the early stages of his public ministry. And as we learned back in chapter 1, verse 39, having embarked on something of a preaching tour around Galilee. We've also got the disciples, the close followers of Jesus. And we know from chapter 1, verses 16 to 20, that they included the 4 fishermen, the 2 sets of brothers, Simon and Andrew, and James and John. And also more recently, as I've already mentioned in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 2, Levi the tax collector. It seems there were others too. It will be a while before Jesus specifically names the 12, but we know that these 5 guys at least were part of his inner circle. Jesus came into contact with the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees made up one of the main groups within the lively and diverse Judaism of the day, and they placed a particular emphasis on holiness and on obedience to the law of Moses. I mentioned the oral law and the layers of interpretation. They were particularly, it seems, passionate about that, because for them that was an expression of what it meant to be faithful to God. It wasn't being legalistic for the sake of it. For them, it was about what it was to be truly holy, truly faithful to the God of Israel, to Yahweh. Mentioned in this text, we have David, the ancestor of Jesus and the greatest king of the people of Israel, who had come by the time of Jesus to be associated with the Messiah, the one who would come to liberate God's people. So David kind of features in the background. And right at the end of this passage, we have the Herodians. Now, nobody's quite sure who the Herodians exactly are. There's this kind of ambiguity about them. But it seems that they would have been associated with at least one of the Herods, quite probably the Herod who was the puppet ruler of Judea. Either way, as we'll see, they form an unholy alliance with the Pharisees in order to target Jesus. Now, we know that Mark's Gospel was the first of the canonical Gospels to be written, likely around 65 to 70 of the Common Era, so before the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. And that cataclysmic event frames an awful lot of what goes on in Mark's Gospel. And particularly, I think, the urgency of Jesus' ministry and mission, something we'll see coming through in this text. And we have, as I say, two controversy scenes that make up a set of 5, taking us from the paralysed man through to the healing of the chap with the withered hand. Now, as is often the case when we come to the New Testament, there are other passages that it's useful for us to keep in mind. We might wish, for example, to look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 24 and 25, which is the section of the law that makes it clear that it was quite legal to pluck the heads of grain and to eat them as you were going along, as long as when you were doing that to somebody else's grain, you didn't then take out your big cutting stuff and start whacking off huge amounts. You could, within reason, I guess it's saying, help yourself to a little bit. We might want to look, and also to contrast, Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12, which get to the heart of the need to observe the Sabbath as a command of God and to keep it holy. Interestingly, in Exodus, the Sabbath is concerned with creation, God's resting on the seventh day, and the command to the people to do likewise. Whereas in Deuteronomy, the emphasis has moved on, and it's about people being reminded that they were once slaves in Egypt and reacting accordingly. So the Sabbath had come to be associated, by the time we get to Deuteronomy, which is later than Exodus, with liberation and with rest for a people who had been enslaved. And I think that comes through in today's reading. We might wish to jump forward a bit in the Hebrew Scriptures to 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 to 6. And that's where we find the story about David eating consecrated bread that was meant for the priests that Jesus references in today's reading. We'll come back to that thought later. And we also might want to look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 to 15. So to go a little further than just verse 12 in Deuteronomy chapter 5, to really get this sense of the Sabbath as sustaining a people who had once been enslaved. So the passage divides into 2 units. Firstly, we've got verses 23 to 28 of chapter 2, and then verses 1 to 6 of chapter 3. The first of those units kind of asks, what is it lawful to do when somebody's hungry? And the second of those units says, effectively, what is it lawful to do when somebody is suffering? So let's initially take those units one at a time and begin with the first one. Begin with chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. Now on the Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples were making their way for a field of grain, the Greek hodos, and they were plucking the heads of grain, something that in our passage from Deuteronomy 23 we see that was permitted. So the Pharisees were not angry with Jesus and his disciples for stealing. They were acting within the law of Moses, what we see in verse 23. But the objection of the Pharisees in verse 24 seems to be around what it actually means to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. I think the Pharisees thought that yes, it was okay according to the law for people to pluck the heads of grain and to munch them as they were going along. But really, couldn't Jesus and his disciples be a bit more respectful of the Sabbath and prepared their snack in advance rather than munching as they went along? So there's a difference in interpretation of what the Sabbath is about. Now in verses 25 and 26, Jesus is seen, I think, looking at this incident through different lenses to those of the Pharisees. And he looks at the Sabbath through the lens of a story about King David. Now, in this incident, recorded in 1 Samuel 21, David was on the run and looking to build allies, having been threatened by King Saul, who at that time was on the throne of Israel. Saul, who wanted to kill David. David being able to eat this consecrated bread in the temple that was meant to be just for the priests, we see that in Leviticus 24 verses 5 through to 9, was about him being sustained and enabled to go on in the midst of his journey towards fulfilling the vocation he had been given by God to replace Saul as king of Israel, which takes us to 1 Samuel 16 verses 1 to 13 for the account of his calling. And this is an example, Jesus says, therefore, of how certain precepts of the law can be set aside in the pursuit of greater values or greater needs. Jesus is effectively saying that just as David took the bread in the temple, even though that was meant to be reserved for specifically for the priests, because of a greater need to sustain him on his journey to becoming king of Israel, so Jesus and his disciples were kind of overruling some of the stuff around the Sabbath in order to sustain themselves in their own ministry and mission, to share the good news, to proclaim that the kingdom of God had come near in word and deed. By arguing in that way, Jesus was on one level doing something that actually quite a few people had done before. It was a fairly standard rabbinic argument. So I don't think the problem was the Pharisees taking umbrage with Jesus because they were overly legalistic. I think there's something deeper going on here. And it's partly, as we see in verse 27, not about the purposes of the Sabbath, though there is an element of that, but partly about the association Jesus has made of himself with King David, who, don't forget, had messianic significance by that point. But also in terms of what he says in verse 28 about being the Lord and Master of the Sabbath. He's showing himself to be no ordinary preacher, and indeed he's claiming for himself significant things that were meant only to belong to God, to be Lord and Master of the Sabbath. So you can imagine the Pharisees going away thinking, who on earth does this man think he is? And I think that comes through in what we find in verses 1 to 6 of chapter 3, our second pericope, where they look to try and entrap Jesus. Jesus is still around Capernaum and enters a synagogue where there just happens to be a man who has a withered hand, we learn in verse 1. The Pharisees were waiting to try and catch Jesus out, to trip him up, to do something that would enable them to attack him, to call him out. In verse 3, Jesus spots this man and asks him to come forward. Now, I find it fascinating that this man is unnamed and apparently doesn't say anything, just meekly complies with what Jesus is asking. And I think it shows the way Mark so often goes about storytelling, that the people that Jesus heals and sets free are often actually not quite incidental, but they're very much secondary in the narrative to this bigger picture of Jesus in conflict with various representatives of existing religious authorities. Now, his response to the Pharisees, when he speaks to them in verse 4, again reframes the purpose of the Sabbath. He reframes it, Jesus, in terms of the importance of the preservation of life, which recalls Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. And it's also clear in the law that the healing that happens in verse 5 does not actually constitute work that was prohibited on the Sabbath. Healing was okay, as it were. And when Jesus heals that man, the unnamed man who never speaks, he does more than just restore him in body, as important as that is. He restores him economically and socially too, because don't forget, we're talking about an era when there wasn't any kind of benefit system or social security net to catch people. His disability would have made him unable to do an awful lot of work and been very, very difficult for him. This restoration would now mean that he could support himself and maybe others economically once again and get back to being at the heart of his community. So what Jesus is doing here is liberation in a broader sense. And I think it brings us again to this idea of different perspectives, looking at the Sabbath through different lenses. I think the glasses that the Pharisees had on led them to see the Sabbath primarily in terms of what you can't do or shouldn't do. Whereas I think Jesus was looking at lenses that showed the Sabbath as the perfect time to do something liberative, to bring about new life. And again, it goes back to this idea of you were once slaves in Egypt. God has set you free, and remembering the liberation of the Exodus. So we've got two very powerful incidents here. Finally, we learn in verse 6, intriguingly, that this incident causes the Pharisees to gang up with the Herodians and to be bent very much on trying to destroy Jesus. The Greek literally means annihilate. It shows us that the cross is already looming on the horizon, even at this point, only 79 verses into Mark's Gospel. And it shows that the way of newness and liberation that Jesus has come to bring by proclaiming that the kingdom of God has come near in word and deed is a challenge very much to those who wanted to maintain the status quo. And for better or worse, it seems that that's how Mark casts the Pharisees and the Herodians who gang up with them as maintainers of the status quo over against this inbreaking of the kingdom, which turns everything upside down and forces one to go back to ask fundamental questions. What are things like the Sabbath actually for? So this is a very rich text and poses some real questions for us today as modern readers. With that thought in mind, we now turn to our questions that are set for this week. you.